All right, so here we go. We're going into chapter 7. Chapter 7 is all about the skeletal system, bone. And I did divide this into 3 parts. The first part is mainly dealing with bone anatomy and the different cell types that you find in bone. And that will be important. It's important for us to have a pretty good foundation for this part 1 in order to understand what's going on in part 2 and part 3. So part 2 is all about bone development, which is important for you to know in order to understand how bone heals. All right, so that should be a pretty short lecture, actually. Then part 3 is really the interesting one. That has to do with bone diseases and calcium homeostasis, which is a really important topic for the chapter. All right, so also a lot of this particular PowerPoint is related to lab as well. So again, because we're doing some bone anatomy here. All right, so I'll let you know when we get to those parts that are probably more pertinent to lab than lecture. Right, so bones and teeth, as it says here, are the most durable remains of a dead body. All right, you already know this. I mean, the teeth can be there forever, all right? The skeleton itself, when it is alive, is made of quite a variety of tissues. It is going to be composed of a lot of blood vessels and nerves. Okay, so what this tells you is that there's really a lot going on in bone tissue, and people are often surprised when they learn about the skeletal system of just how much function and physiology is happening inside bone tissue. It's actually really interesting. Something else real interesting about bone tissue compared to other types of tissue is that bone is constantly remodeling itself, and it actually, well, it does interact with other systems of the body, but also I want to point out that bone tissue is very responsive to the environment. It's very responsive to you and your lifestyle. It's very responsive to your behavior, all right? And we'll get into that a little later, okay? But understand bone tissue is very dynamic, and bone tissue is very flexible, all right? It is capable of a great degree of remodeling, and actually it's remodeling all throughout life, and that's something we'll talk about in part 2 and 3. Osteology, of course, is the study of bone. So when you see that prefix osteo, that means bone. What kind of tissues are going to make up the skeletal system? Well, of course, bones will make up the skeletal system, but also remember, cartilage and ligaments are considered part of the skeletal system. All right, so cartilage we're going to find associated with joints for the most part. And also what we'll learn in part 2 is that all bone actually comes from cartilage. Okay, so we are all cartilage at first as far as the skeletal system, but eventually that cartilage starts to differentiate into bone tissue. Okay, so cartilage becomes bone. Yeah, and so we'll see, examples of cartilage in the knee joint, especially in lab. Also for some cartilage associated with the rib cage, right? We already looked at costal cartilage, which connects the ribs to the sternum. And then ligaments, of course, are associated with the skeletal system. And remember that ligaments are going to attach bone to bone. Now, tendons can also be associated with the skeletal system because tendons attach muscle to bone, all right? But tendons can also be considered part of the muscular system for the same reason. So as far as skeletal cartilage, okay, when we say skeletal cartilage, we're talking about cartilage associated with the skeleton. And keep in mind that specifically this cartilage is hyaline. It is hyaline cartilage. All right, so these terms are really interchangeable. Okay, so skeletal cartilage is hyaline. All right. And like I already said, actually, see, but bone actually will be cartilage. All right, before it's bone, it's cartilage. All right, but cartilage gets triggered by the nervous system to start becoming bone. All right, and that will be the case throughout the skeleton, the main bones of the skeleton, except in areas that are where flexibility is required. For example, with costal cartilage, like I just mentioned, right? We need flexibility there because we're inhaling and exhaling, right? The lungs are there behind the ribs, and so we need some there. Remember, cartilage, hyaline cartilage, is not vascular. It also does not contain a nerve supply. However, perichondrium, so peri meaning around, chondro meaning cartilage. So perichondrium is something that surrounds cartilage. Okay, and so this area does contain blood vessels, so that we can get a limited is really a key word there, a limited delivery of nutrition to the cartilage by way of the blood vessels in the perichondrium. But guess what? It's not going to be much. All right, the cartilage is really not going to get a whole lot. Okay, from these blood vessels, very limited, and that explains partly why, you might recall, why cartilage does not heal very well on its own. Okay. The perichondrium also sort of protects the cartilage because it helps to resist any outward expansion by the cartilage. Okay. Now, I could relate this because I've had a couple of questions about it. So I could relate this to the intervertebral discs, right? So you have your intervertebral discs in the vertebral column. These are pieces of fibrocartilage that are existing in between each of your vertebrae. And so the fibrocartilage is also surrounded by perichondrium. And over time, what ends up happening is this perichondrium wears away over time, all right? And we're no longer able to resist this outward expansion of the cartilage. And what happens is there's a little fluid, actually, that's inside of fibrocartilage called lamina propulsa. You don't need to know that word, but it's like a gel fluid that starts to seep out of the fibrocartilage in the intervertebral disc because we have a wearing away of that perichondrium over time. Okay, so that is what would be considered a ruptured disc, all right, because this perichondrium has worn away, and a lot of times, you know it again, it's going to be associated with older age, just with wear and tear, normal wear and tear. We can have ruptured discs, or it could be due to trauma, all right, if that perichondrium is somehow penetrated or torn. Okay, so cartilage is made of chondrocytes. You remember this. Chondro means cartilage. So cartilage has chondrocytes, and these chondrocytes are going to be existing in these lacunae, which are little cavities that serve to protect these mature cartilage cells. And also cartilage, as you might remember when we talked about cartilage in chapter 4, there is an extracellular matrix surrounding it. And remember that in cartilage, young cartilage, we're going to have chondroblasts as well. And I remember mentioning that over time, we don't get, or we start to lose the number of chondroblasts that we have. So 3 types of cartilage. We've already talked about these, so this is really just a review. I don't need to go into great detail about them again. But, since we are talking about the skeletal system, we do need to talk, or, I just need to give you a reminder here of the 3 types of cartilage found. Hyaline, excuse me. This is the most abundant kind. Remember that it has collagen. Recall your locations, okay, for hyaline cartilage. We're going to find hyaline cartilage associated with joints, and because of that, it's sometimes referred to as articular cartilage. Articular means joints. Costal cartilage, okay, associated with the ribs. Now, costal cartilage can also be called articular cartilage because really these are kind of like joints there, okay? Now, the respiratory system, there is hyaline found in the area called the larynx, and also in the nose, the tip of the nose. This is made of hyaline cartilage. Elastic cartilage is similar in appearance to hyaline cartilage, all right, but it's going to have something extra in it, right? It's going to have these elastic fibers. And where do we find it? The external ear and the epiglottis. Fibrocartilage, I just kind of talked about, right? We find these in the vertebral or intervertebral disc. You find these in the menisci of the knee, which you'll have to know those menisci for lab. And fibrocartilage, remember, is, it's really strong. It's the strongest kind of cartilage, and, it's just loaded up with collagen. So I wanted to mention a little something about this epiglottis. So the epiglottis is shown right down here. Okay, so that I wanted you to see this sort of anatomy going on here. All right, so we have here anterior, we have the trachea. All right, now posterior to the trachea is the esophagus. Remember not to confuse these two tubes. A lot of people confuse these two tubes. Trachea is part of the respiratory system. It leads to the lungs. The esophagus is part of the digestive system leading to the stomach. So now we have this really underappreciated structure here called the epiglottis. And, again, this is going to be made of elastic cartilage. And what's going to happen is it's going to cover, as part of the swallowing response, okay, so when you're eating, this epiglottis is triggered to move over the trachea and cover the trachea. So that way, whatever you're eating and drinking is going to be diverted down the esophagus instead of down to the right. And again, sometimes this epiglottis can fail. All right, maybe the reflex doesn't work perfectly. It's just sort of random if that happens. And that can happen. And you would end up like the food would end up being expelled. Well, it's going to be expelled out of the nasal cavity, for example. It'll go right back up here and come out the nose. That's like if you're laughing and eating at the same time, that kind of thing might happen, right? The food will just go right back. It will be forced back up if you're lucky. Now, sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes it ends up going down to the lungs. Okay, again, if that epiglottis closed and it's not expelled backwards out or out through the oral cavity, then yeah, that food or drink will actually go down to the trachea. All right. And that is a very uncomfortable experience. I'm not sure if you've ever had that happen, but it will get down as far as the end of the trachea. And then it really shouldn't go down to the lungs. I mean, it's possible, but food and drink typically, if it reaches the bottom of the trachea, there's a little structure down at the bottom that's really going to forcefully send that material back up. Okay. But now let's say you have, and this leads to a disease that I want you all to know about. This disease or condition is called epiglottitis. Now, if you look at the notes below this slide, I did write some information down there for you. So make sure you check that out because that's talking about this condition called epiglottitis. And I do think you should know about it. It's something that is not really talked about that much, but you should know about it because it's a really dangerous situation in a baby, all right? And you should be able to recognize if this is a possibility in a baby, all right? So let me explain. So epiglottitis, itis, I'm just going to add an itis on there, which means inflammation, okay? So there can be a couple of causes to the inflammation of the epiglottis. One could simply be bacteria, okay, or viral. If they get attached to this epiglottis and start metabolizing, then you will have an inflammatory situation around the epiglottis. So imagine if that epiglottis gets swollen, okay? If it swells out, then what you're going to have happen is a blocking of the trachea, okay? Because the epiglottis will get so large, all right, that it's going to start to block part of this trachea opening, right? That's going to cause problems breathing, right? Now, another cause to epiglottitis, another cause to this is, let's say there's a child, I don't know, 1-year-old, or 6, 8 months old, right? And they're starting to examine the world, right? They want to learn more about their atmosphere and their external environment. So they're starting to touch a lot of different things, and they do investigation by putting things in their mouth, right? You all know this, right? This is how really young ones start to learn about their environment. They will actually pick things up and put them in their mouth. Like, is this something I can eat? Okay, it's not something I can eat, or it is. Now, of course, what can we have happen, right? We can have whatever that baby's picking up, a little toy or something, or whatever they pick up, they put it in their mouth, and what can happen? It might get down here, right? And so if that happens, maybe they end up swallowing it. Maybe it goes down to the stomach, okay? And if that happens, it can graze that epiglottis and damage that epiglottis, causing the epiglottis to swell. Or it could end up going down the trachea, right? In either case, a lot of times we'll get this this epiglottis will be damaged. All right, so here's the idea, is that this is a very dangerous, potentially fatal situation, because especially in a baby, right? This is something more commonly seen in a baby, because the baby can't tell you what's going on, right? I'm talking about children that are not talking yet. How do they communicate with you? They cry. That's how they communicate. That's how they talk to you. So to recognize if something like this is occurring in a child, that's one of the things you're going to look for, is they're going to feel extremely restless. They're going to seem very irritable. They're going to be crying, trying to alert you that something is wrong. You may also hear what is called stridor. Stridor is when there's like a whistling sound when they're breathing, all right? Now, the last and final sign that you would see would be cyanosis. All right, cyanosis means that the blood is low on hemoglobin, and that's having to do with the fact that this person is not exchanging carbon dioxide and oxygen very well, right? Their lungs are hindered because epiglottis is blocking off the trachea. Definitely, if you see cyanosis in a baby, well, that's a bad sign. Now, if you have this combination of symptoms put together, you really need to consider it a medical emergency and take that child to the ER immediately, all right, because they could die from this, all right? So just, showing you an example of a condition that could start out kind of innocent, just what is it? Oh, it's epiglottis of this little structure, inflammation of this little tiny structure called the epiglottis, big deal. Well, that can actually lead to death, all right? So just throwing it out there. Now, you can have an adult get this, of course, all right? And in this case, hopefully would not be due to swallowing foreign objects, but it may. More likely in the adult is going to be due to some sort of bacterial infection. All right, so do be aware of that. Sure, you have a question about epiglottitis. All right, so here's the skeleton. What this is doing, just color coding here for you the different types of cartilage and where you would find that. All right, and I've already went over it, but if you want to see like a color-coded version, where you find the cartilage, that's there. Functions of bones. In chapter 1, you already studied functions of the skeletal system, so a lot of this is just review. So support, right? Of course, bones are going to help support the body. And soft organs, because bones form cavities. Protection, right? So, for example, the cranium, which is bone, protects the brain. We have the vertebral column, right, consisting of vertebrae, which are going to protect the soft tissue of the spinal cord. And then organs, again, protect organs because, again, the bones form cavities. Now, movement indirectly, you remember this because I like everybody to know that bones do not move, right? Muscle moves bones, all right? Mineral and growth factor storage. Yeah, so this is one, especially with minerals here, that we're going to talk a lot about in part 3. All right, calcium, mineral and growth factor storage. So yeah, bone serves as a storage site for minerals. The ones we really care about are calcium and phosphorus. Remember the importance of phosphorus, right? It'll be converted to phosphate in the human body to make up our very important ATP molecule. And then, of course, there are growth factors present in bone, growth factors that are going to play a role in bone development. Cell formation, yes. You remember that we form blood cells in bone. You should know, so this is called hematopoiesis. And you should know where this is happening exactly. All right, so we're having hematopoiesis occur specifically in the red marrow, okay, of bone. Now, where is the red bone marrow? Red bone marrow is at the ends of long bones, at the ends of long bones. Now, if we're dealing with flat bones, you'll find it dispersed out all throughout the middle, all right? But most of our hematopoiesis is occurring in red bone marrow at the ends of long bones. Triglyceride storage. We also store fat in our bones. Yes. Okay, so fat is specifically going to be stored in another marrow cavity called yellow bone marrow. And you should know that in long bones, yellow marrow is situated in the middle of the bone, in the middle. We also have some hormone production happening in bones. Osteocalcin, we're really not going to get too much into that hormone, but you should just know it exists. Osteocalcin is a hormone that's going to be associated with regulating insulin secretion from the pancreas, okay? And so this also is going to affect glucose levels, of course, and metabolism. So osteocalcin is an example of a hormone made by bone tissue. Okay, there are 206 bones in the skeleton. So I hope you all will appreciate that when you are studying bones in lab and realize that you are not being asked to know all 206. You're only asked to know like maybe 50 or so structures, okay, of bone. Okay, so know that there's much more to know about bones than what you're being asked to know in lab, okay? So yeah, the skeleton is going to be divided into two main parts, axial skeleton. So the axial skeleton is basically like the torso, all right? It includes the vertebral column and its attachment to the rib cage, all right? And then the skull. The skull is also considered part of axial skeleton. Appendicular, we're dealing with the limbs, upper and lower limbs. And it says here the girdles attaching the limbs. So we're talking about the scapula, for example, and its attachment to the humerus, okay, scapula blade. And another girdle would be considered the pelvis, all right, and how the pelvic bones attach to the femur, for example. And then again, this is color coded so that you can see, you know, which part is the axial skeleton, which you can see is basically like the torso plus the skull. And then the rest is appendicular skeleton. So bones you can also classify as organs. And remember, that's just going to go back to our basic definition of what an organ is. It is going to be composed of many different types of tissues, multiple types. Okay, so in bone, the main tissue that we see is called osseous or bone tissue. Okay, bone tissue is a tissue by itself. But also, you know, as part of what, if we're going to consider an organ, you also find nervous tissue, you find cartilage associated with it, you find other kinds of connective tissue associated with it. Muscle cells will be seen, epithelial cells, because we have blood vessels, right? We have blood vessels. In fact, we have an extremely high supply of blood in bone. I mean, you know, you notice this if you break a bone, right? If you break a bone, there's going to be a lot of bleeding because there are a lot of blood vessels there, right? And remember, blood vessels lined by epithelial cells, okay? So we have all these different tissues making up bone, and this is partly what makes bone so dynamic. Okay, so it says here, osseous tissue is that does not seem phrased properly. Osseous tissue is CT, the matrix. Okay, it's connective tissue. The matrix, right, is you're going to find a matrix in the osseous tissue, and that matrix is hardened. All right, this is what gives the bone a hard quality, is the fact that the matrix is considered calcified. Calcified means calcium has been deposited there. All right, so bones are considered calcified, okay, because calcium crystallizes. It actually crystallizes in the bone, okay, and so this is going to make the bone hard. All right, and remember, we also have phosphate there. So compact versus spongy bone, okay, if we look at the bone inside and out, we can say that it is made of compact tissue or spongy. So compact bone is the outer layer. Okay, so this is the outer part of the bone that you see. This part is very solid and smooth. The spongy bone is going to be inside the bone. Okay, spongy bone is inside. And it looks like a honeycomb. That's why it's called spongy bone. So, but what are these little honeycomb-like structures? They're called trabeculae. Trabeculae. And these are these little open spaces, okay? And inside of these little trabeculae, they're like little holes, all right? Like a honeycomb network, right? The trabeculae, the holes there are going to help hold bone marrow, okay? And again, you're going to find these really, you're going to find this spongy bone in the middle or the center, okay, of the bones. You'd also find, remember that you also find bone marrow at the ends of long bones, right? So remember, bone marrow is going to have this trabeculae, okay? So you find trabeculae at the ends of long bones. You also find it running down the center of long bones. And if it's a flat bone, this is all just sorted together in the middle. All right, so again, more on the structure of bone. Okay, so what you find is that, you know, in general, what we have is spongy bone covered on the outside by compact bone all around. Now, there is a membrane, okay, associated with the bone. All right, we have periosteum and endosteum. Okay, peri meaning to the periphery or to the outside of something. So periosteum is a connective tissue membrane, okay, that lines the outside of compact bone. Okay, so if you were to dissect someone right before you turn to the bone, you're going to find first this layer directly outside of the compact bone called periosteum. Right? Now, if you dissect a little further and cut through the compact bone, then the next thing you would find deeper to that, inside of the bone, is this other layer called endosteum. And endosteum is going to be covering the compact bone on the inside of that bone. Okay, as mentioned, bone marrow is scattered, you know, throughout spongy bone. It's a little more localized. Again, we'll find that spongy bone localized to the ends of long bones where you find red bone marrow, and just an area sort of right in the center of long bones where you find yellow bone marrow. Okay, but if we're dealing with a flat bone, you know, you're going to deal with bone marrow being scattered. Now, of course, hyaline cartilage is going to cover any part of a joint that makes up, I'm sorry, let me say that again. Hyaline cartilage is going to cover any area of a bone that is associated with a joint. All right, so that means you're going to find hyaline cartilage, for example, at the ends of your long bones where you find joints, because that hyaline cartilage gives a sort of a smooth surface on the ends of those bones, so that movement is easier. Here's a picture. All right, so we're taking like a part of the cranium here, and we're blowing that up. Now, the cranium is considered a flat bone. It's flat. Okay, so again, what you find in the flat bone is that on the very outside and on the very inside, you find compact bone. And sandwiched in the middle is your spongy bone. Now, if you magnify that, you can really see these trabeculae, right? Okay, so these trabeculae that make up spongy bone and result in the formation of all these holes. And so it's in these holes where you're going to find marrow stored. Also, what you find in these holes are all your blood vessels and nerves traveling. Okay, again, a lot of times when you find like a hole through a bone, like you see here with these trabeculae, it is there in order to accommodate for the traversing of blood vessels and nerves. Okay, so trabeculae accommodate for those vessels and nerves and also serve as sort of local areas where the marrow can exist. Here's just another picture of it, trabeculae. All right, typical structure of a long bone. Definitely want to know this. I'm sure there'll be a question on this. And you'll also want to know this for lab as well. Okay, so the structure of a typical long bone, and let's just actually go to the picture. Yeah. Okay, so long bone. So this is a humerus. This is a picture of a humerus. What's the deal here with this? Okay, so the long bone is going to have three main okay, we have the shaft, okay, which is basically the long portion here in the middle. You should know that this is called the diaphysis. Diaphysis, practice saying that word. Diaphysis. Now at the ends, all right, you have what are known as epiphyses. Epiphyses is plural. Epiphysis is singular. So at each end you have an epiphysis. Now, in any case where you have two parts that have the same name, you have to distinguish them, right? So we do need, and definitely you should know the difference, okay, when we're dealing with long bones, okay? The epiphysis that is attached, okay, to the axial skeleton is called the proximal epiphysis. Proximal. Remember the distinction between proximal and distal. Proximal, we're closer to the site of attachment to the trunk. Distal, okay, is going to be the other end. This is going to be the epiphysis that is further away from the site of attachment to the axial skeleton, okay, or to the trunk, all right? So know the difference between proximal and distal epiphysis. What else do we see? Okay, in the very middle here of the diaphysis, you have a cavity, all right? It's actually a cavity. That cavity is called the medullary cavity. Spongy bone. Remember that in a long bone, you will see spongy bone located in the ends, which we can now refer to as the epiphyses. Okay, spongy bone will be there. You will find some spongy bone also, located in the diaphysis. But remember that we're going to have this medullary cavity here. It's a cavity. Okay, so you're going to find blood vessels and nerves and everything going through there. Okay. What else? Oh, we have this, okay? This is the epiphyseal line. Now, in part 2, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about actually something called the epiphyseal plate. When your bones are developing, okay, when you're growing tall, you have something called the epiphyseal plate, which again, we will talk about in part 2. When you're an adult, when you're done growing tall, when your bones are finished developing lengthwise, instead we have the epiphyseal line, okay? And so you can see this is like a line here. And again, we'll get into that in part 2. Of course, at the ends here, because we're forming joints at this part, this is articular cartilage. Now remember, articular cartilage is hyaline. It's hyaline cartilage. All right. So that's really the anatomy of the long bone. And on this previous slide here is just saying everything I just said in words here, right? So diaphysis. Remember that The yellow marrow is going to be existing in the diaphysis inside of the medullary cavity, right? The epiphyses, all right, surrounded by hyaline or articular cartilage. And then I did mention something here about that epiphyseal line. The epiphyseal line is going to be located between the diaphysis and each epiphysis, right? So in essence, you will have two epiphyseal lines, right? Because you have two epiphyses. Now, again, the epiphyseal line is a bony structure. It's a bone, it's calcified, but it's a remnant of a cartilage structure in childhood called the epiphyseal plate. Just another picture of spongy bone. Notice again that we're having, blood vessels go through all of these, all right? This demonstrates to you how vascular we can have our bone because all these little blood vessels can go through all this spongy bone here, all right? So there's a great deal of blood supply in bone. There's a great deal of transport happening. You can get anything anywhere it needs to go in bone because we have a very complex, intricate network of travel that can happen through all of these spongy bone, through all of the trabeculae and spongy bone. Okay, so back to the membranes. Remember I mentioned that there's a periosteum and an endosteum. So we're going to detail that out just a little bit here, all right? So remember that the periosteum is going to be the outer layer, the external surface of compact bone. So you should know the periosteum is going to be made of two layers. Periosteum we can break down into two other layers. It has a fibrous layer and an osteogenic layer. So the fibrous layer is just structural, all right? It contains these fibers that we call Sharpie's fibers, which are actually collagen fibers, all right? So this outer layer is made of Sharpie fibers, and these really strong collagen fibers are going to help secure the periosteum to the bone. Okay, so really this fibrous, this outer layer of the periosteum is really just a structural layer. The inner layer of the periosteum is functional. This is a functional layer. This contains stem cells, okay? We call them osteogenic stem cells. And these osteogenic stem cells, of course, are going to give rise to our other bone cells. Okay, so the periosteum has it has lots of nerves, all right, just like the inside of the bone. Lots of blood vessels, just like the inside of bone. And they're going to continue on, okay, these vessels are going to continue on through the bone through what are called nutrient foramen. Okay, so the periosteum has these little openings called nutrient foramen, all right, because we're going to carry our nutrition through our vessels through these little foramen. All right, so that was the periosteum. The inner layer is the endosteum, okay, and the endosteum is simply just going to cover the internal bone surface, right? So it covers the trabeculae of the spongy bone, okay? And also you will find osteogenic cells there as well. Here is sort of a picture of this, all right? We've got our bone, and then on the very outside, we have our periosteum. And notice you can see these little fibers here, right? These are these really strong collagen fibers that are going to hold or attach the periosteum to the cone outside here, okay? And we just call those Sharpie's fibers. Here's an artery, okay? They call it a nutrient artery. Well, and really you could say all arteries are nutrient arteries, but anyway. So anyway, we have an artery going through, right? And it's going to go through these little nutrient foramen, okay, which are holes in the periosteum to get inside. Now, endosteum is just going to be this a very not very noticeable in this picture, but it will be lining the inside, okay? Just another way of looking at it, if you want to see all that, we've already talked about it. Okay, really important, the next several slides, or next few slides. I'd say probably the most important part of this entire PowerPoint is this. The cell types that we find in bone. The reason this is so important is because everything we study for the rest of this chapter, you have to understand what these cells are and what these cells do. Almost all of bone physiology outside of hormone synthesis is based on the activity of these cells. So we got to know. All right, so there are 5 cell types we're going to find in bone tissue. And notice that I have 3 of them underlined. That is because those are the 3 that we're really going to focus on. All right, I'm only just going to mention the other 2. So let's get into these. The first one, osteogenic cells. So again, these are going to be your stem cells that specifically are going to be doing mitosis, forming bone cells. Okay, so when osteogenic cells divide, okay, for the most part, they're going to differentiate into osteoblasts. They're also going to differentiate into bone lining cells. Okay, and also osteogenic cells can directly differentiate into osteoclasts. So let me go back here for a second. So osteogenic cells, right, again, these are our stem cells. Osteogenic cells will become osteoblasts. Mainly, they're going to become osteoblasts, okay? Or they will differentiate into bone lining cells. It's also possible for them to become osteoclasts. Okay, remember when we say blast, osteoblast, that's a developmental cell. Okay, so basically in bone, the cell line that is created is pretty specific. It's actually very complicated, and we don't need to get into the real big details about it. Going to try to keep that basic, okay? But you do remember, osteoblasts are developmental cells that will become a mature cell. Okay, but here in bone tissue, we do have stem cells that will become osteoblasts. They will become bone lining cells, and they will become osteoclasts. They will not become osteocytes. Okay, the reason for that is because osteogenic cells will become osteoblasts. Osteoblasts will be the ones that become osteocytes. Remember that a blast cell will differentiate into a site cell. All right, so, big deal about osteogenic cells. Again, they're going to form bone cells, they're stem cells. Remember where they come from, okay? So they come from mesenchyme, okay? Mesenchyme. So mesenchyme is found in the adult in red bone marrow. All right, and so these cells are continuously undergoing mitosis to give rise to other bone cells. Okay, so your first really important one here, really important one, osteoblast. I will often abbreviate this as OB. All right, so what do you need to know about these extremely important bone cells? They form bone. Okay, remember, this is a developmental cell. So what it's going to do is it's going to make part of the matrix. It's going to actually make and secrete some of the components of the bone tissue. Now, in bone physiology, we call this bone deposition. So basically, the osteoblast is depositing bone tissue. Okay, that is really, really what you need to know here. Okay, osteoblasts build up bone tissue. They actually build up bone tissue and do this very important process called bone deposition. They are literally depositing bone tissue. Okay, very important cell. Now, osteoblast, again, it's a blast, so that means it can be mitotic. So if an osteoblast is mitotic, that means that it will differentiate into an osteocyte. But this is important to keep in mind, that we have actually a very large population of osteoblasts that are not mitotic. That is because we have to keep these osteoblasts forever, all right? because they do this very important job of bone deposition. All right, so you will have an osteoblast population that will go off and become osteocytes, and then you have an osteoblast population that takes another path and just stays as an osteoblast and has a very important function as an osteoblast in bone deposition. Okay, so osteoid is another word for the matrix of bone. Okay, so osteoblasts are going to be making this osteoid. All right, and part of this osteoid is collagen. All right, there is collagen there. So osteoblasts are making and secreting collagen. And very importantly, they're making something called CBPs. These are calcium binding proteins, CBPs. Okay, so CBPs do just what they sound like. CBPs are going to bind calcium in the osteoid. All right, this is why and how we're able to store calcium in our bone tissue, because these CBPs keep that calcium bound into the tissue, not freeing it up. Okay, so it's stored there. Now, actually, as far as what kind of protein you find in bone, most of it is collagen made by osteoblasts. Okay, so again, osteoblasts are going to synthesize the matrix. And, you're going to see why these osteoblasts are so important when we look at part 2 and part 3, all right? Because osteoblasts are very, very involved, I'm sure you can imagine, in bone development. But they're also very important to understand when we talk about bone pathology, when we talk about the diseases of bone. All right, osteoblasts are really going to come into play there. Now, when you have stress on a bone, so this means exercise, for example, all right? Let's say someone's exercising a lot. This puts stress on the bone tissue. And what that causes, it causes osteogenic cells, okay, to multiply and to differentiate into osteoblasts. Because if you're putting stress on the bone, and this is what I was talking about in the beginning when I mentioned that bone is so responsive, okay? Bone is very, very active. It responds to your lifestyle. It responds to your actions and your behavior, all right? So that's an example. If you're exercising a lot, this is going to result in an increased number of osteoblasts being born, first of all, from our stem cells. And so if you have more osteoblasts, you're going to have an increase in bone deposition. All right, so the bone gets triggered to become thicker, to have more matrix, more osteoid when stress or pressure is placed on them. Okay, again, this is very adaptive. Bone adapts to your activity. Okay, so another little role there of osteoblasts. And so specifically, we talked about osteocalcin. It's osteoblasts that actually secrete that osteocalcin hormone, which is involved in regulating insulin secretion. Okay, so you can see the osteoblast is pretty important. All right, the third cell type is the osteocyte. Okay, the osteocyte, so it's cyte, so that means it's a mature bone cell. And, if it's a mature bone cell, it's no longer capable of cell division. It will never be anything else. Okay, it is mature. Okay, so because of that, we have to have them existing in lacunae. I think that's on a different slide. Okay, but osteocytes are kind of like chondrocytes. Remember, chondrocytes are existing in these little cavities called lacunae. Osteocytes are also going to be existing in lacunae because they cannot become anything else. This is their terminal fate, to be an osteocyte. So in order to protect that final version of the cell, we do have them placed in these little protective, I do have it written here, these protective cavity called lacunae. Now, what's the function of osteocytes? Okay, so osteocytes really are going to help maintain the bone matrix. Okay, they're going to help maintain the bone matrix. Now, osteocytes are really elusive cells, they're actually being studied because it's becoming known that they do much more than just maintain the bone matrix. Right? What's being discovered about these osteocytes pretty recently is that they do a lot more. Okay, they are actually considered communicators. Right? That's probably your key word here for osteocyte is that these cells are really considered communicators. Here's what happens. So signals from the brain, okay, you know the brain tells the body everything. So the brain will signal osteocytes. And those osteocytes will then communicate information osteoblasts and our other really important cell that we haven't talked about yet called the osteoclast. So this is largely related to bone remodeling, okay? So, you know, again, if you have an increase in physical activity, for example, all right, you know, just kind of staying on that example, then the brain will signal the osteocytes to instruct osteoblasts to start laying down more matrix to make that bone thicker, for example. Okay, so osteocytes have really come to be known to play a role, a much more active role as communicators. All right, so again, they're going to communicate to and from osteoblasts and osteoclasts in response to signals that it receives by the brain. And this will play a big role in bone remodeling. Now, the structure of this cell, okay, it has these processes, cytoplasmic processes. All right, they're like extensions of the cytoplasm. And these little processes are actually going to reach out through these little canals that I'll mention in bone tissue so that these processes can reach these osteoblasts and osteoclasts in order to send them signals. Now, understand that the signals that this osteocyte is giving, these are not electrical signals, okay? These are not the same as like signaling that the brain can do or signaling that muscle does, all right? Not the same kind of signaling. The signaling is restricted to chemical, all right? Chemical signaling, okay? So chemicals will be sent all along through these osteocytes to osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Now, of course, in order to allow easy passage of signals, these cells are going to be surrounded by gap junctions. Here's a picture of an osteocyte. Now the osteocyte is sitting in this cavity. Look here. Okay, this surrounding cavity is the lacuna, right? Because remember, osteocytes, you only have so many of them, right? So you need to protect them. And look at these processes. All right, these are cytoplasmic projections here, okay, that are going to actually go through the lacunae. All right, they're going to go through there and travel. These processes are going to stretch out far, okay, in order to reach the other bone cells to tell them what to do. Next cell type, again, I'm not going to focus too much on this one, but we do have this other cell type called bone lining cells. All right, and you know, these are really just structural, okay? They don't have a lot of physiology compared to osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. Okay, where do you find them? You're going to find them in periosteum, okay, and endosteum, basically. Again, they just sort of serve as like a structural role that lining the bones in as part of these membranes. Okay, last one, very, very important, osteoclast. So you want to look at osteoclast as being like the opposite of osteoblasts. What that means is osteoclasts, instead of building up bone like osteoblasts do, osteoclasts are going to break down bone. Now, initially, that might not make very much sense. It's like, why would we want to break down bone? Well, we're going to see that there are some very important reasons that we have to break down bone. So this osteoclast, we're gonna see it again, and see why it's important that we have the ability to break down bone. Now, what do we call this? We call this bone resorption. Okay, so your big definitions here for osteoclasts is that osteoclasts do bone resorption. They're actually going to break down the matrix of bone. Okay, and remember that its opposite is the osteoblast. The osteoblast functions in bone deposition, where it's going to deposit or lay down matrix, right? Now, as far as how this one develops, it's actually kind of complicated, so we're not going to get too much into it. But basically, you know, our osteogenic cells will become osteoclasts. Right? Okay, structurally, this cell is very interesting. It has a unique structure to it. It has these little ruffled borders. And so you should know that these little ruffled borders are going to help increase the surface area over which this osteoclast can break down bone tissue. This ruffled border is also going to help seal off the area that's being degraded. So let's see kind of like what this looks like. All right, so here's an osteoclast on the right here. And so notice we have this ruffled border. They look kind of like microvilli, don't they? That's because they have a similar function of microvilli. These are not microvilli. This is called the ruffled border of the osteoclast. But you can relate these functionally to microvilli, okay? Because these are going to help increase the surface area over which this cell can do its degradation of bone tissue. And it's going to seal off, okay? It's going to seal off. And actually, it's going to absorb, all right? It's going to absorb the matrix. It's going to break it down with all these really powerful enzymes it has. While we're at it, look over here at the osteocyte. All right, osteocyte, remember, is going to have all these processes, okay? And so it's going to be sending chemical signals down all these processes towards our other cell types, like the osteoclast and the osteoblast. Okay, so the osteocyte, for example, can tell this osteoclast to do bone resorption. Okay, remember that osteoclasts and osteoblasts, they don't just know what to do, okay, by themselves. They need instruction. They need instruction from the osteocyte, and the osteocyte receives that instruction from the brain. Bone cells and their development, not a big deal on this really at all, okay? Remember, we have osteogenic cell. It will develop into an osteoblast. Osteoblast will develop into an osteocyte. Remember that osteoblasts, we do retain, we keep a population of osteoblasts, and that population of osteoblasts will not become osteocytes. They will remain as osteoblasts because our osteoblasts are so important physiologically for bone deposition. All right. We have other stem cells that are going to result in osteoclasts. Some chemical composition of the bone matrix. We do have some organic components. Of course, you already know we're going to have collagen in there. All right, and we'll bring up collagen again when we talk about bone healing. Inorganic components. Now, mainly, you know, all we want to take from this is the really big one here. All right, yeah, we do store mineral salts, and you know, it says 65% of bone mass. Okay, so our minerals are going to make up quite a bit of the weight. Okay, or I'm sorry, not the weight, but the mass of the bone. Calcium phosphate, like I said, really is our big deal. We are going to store calcium phosphate. A little bit on the histology of osseous tissue. What you're seeing on the right here is trabeculae. What you're seeing down here is an osteon. And the osteon has all these different parts to it. And I don't know if I want to talk about that right now. Oh, yeah, I do. Yep. Okay. So compact bone, all right. Now, you know spongy bone is made of trabeculae. Compact bone is going to consist of this unit called an osteon, which is also known as an haversian system. Now, the osteon has its own anatomy, and we're going to talk about all the parts of the osteon. So let's do it. So the osteon is the main structural unit of compact bone, and they're like little pillars. All right, they're like pillars, and they function in weight bearing for one. And so we're actually going to be able to break this osteon down into different parts. So what you'll see is that the osteon is made of these rings, okay? These rings, they're circles, okay? And these are called lamellae. Lamellae is plural. If you take the E off of there and say lamella, that's singular. All right, in the very middle of the osteon, we have something called the central canal, also known as the haversian canal. It is an empty space. It's just a canal that, well, I shouldn't say it's empty. When you're not alive, it's empty, okay? But when you're alive, what's going down, as with almost any hole through a bone, what are we doing? We're having blood vessels and nerves go through there. Also in the osteon, you find these perforating canals, which can also be called Volkmann's canals. And so these are going to be canals that run in a different direction compared to the central canal. They're going to run at right angles to the central canal. And again, they have the same function. Okay, they're going to be carrying vessels. Lacunae, yes, we have lacunae, okay, that contain osteocytes within this osteon. Caniculi. So these are really tiny canals that are going to connect the lacunae to each other and to the central canal. So basically what you should be gathering from all this anatomy right now is that, wow, there is a major transport system possible here in bone because of all of these canals and all these different ways that we can transport nutrition. All right, so huge transport system, very, very meticulous transport system in bone. So let's take a look. Okay. All we really want to see here, actually, this is not the greatest picture, but what you can see here is up here is actually the central canal. It's this hole, and it's going to contain all of our vessels. All right, this is a little bit better in terms of looking at these different parts. So, okay, if you look here, one of these circular units, each one of these circular units is called an osteon. Now, the little circle right in the middle, okay, the little one right in the middle is the central canal. Now, notice that surrounding that central canal, we have these rings, okay? In each case, we have a few circles or rings going around the whole thing. Those are your lamellae, okay? The lamellae. And sort of what we're seeing is half of an osteon down here, and you can see it a little bit closer up, okay? It's like half of an osteon. Central canal in the middle, and we're going to have our lamellae, okay? The lamellae are these rings around that's going to surround the central canal. Okay, what else? We can see a little bit here, these little caniculi. So the caniculi means like mini canals or miniature canals. So the caniculi are these really tiny lines that you see here, the really tiny canals that run in the opposite direction of both the lamellae and the central canal. Now, what we'll see in the lamellae, okay, in the lamellae, remember the rings around the central canal, these lamellae are going to contain our lacunae, okay, and remember that those little lacunae are containing osteocytes. Now, what else here? We have, remember, we have our central canals, okay, and look at all this transport that's possible here. Now, here is a perforating or a Volkmann's canal, right? These go perpendicular to the central canal. So again, this just demonstrates to you what intricate kind of transport we're able to do here in the bone tissue. Definitely something you will need to know for lab. We do have a model of the osteon. That will be lab 7, I believe. So you definitely will want to know all the different parts of the osteon. Kind of looks like a tree trunk, right? Osteon. Each unit or each osteon looks like sort of like after you cut a tree, right? Here we go. Okay, and this is good because again, in blue, we're shading the area here. Okay, so osteon, central canal in the middle. Okay, lamella, right? The lamellae are going to be rings around the central canal. The pediculi, remember these really tiny, tiny lines that are perpendicular to the lamellae. And then lining the lamellae, you have lacunae. Look how they're all sort of arranged circular because they're inside this lamella. And then osteocytes will be inside of those lacunae. Just another picture. Again, here's an osteon. You can kind of see these a little bit more close up here with these different parts of the osteon. And that's it. All right, so you have done everything you need, I think, for this lecture when it comes to bone anatomy, or I mean bone tissue anatomy for what we're going to do in lecture. Okay, again, remember the most important part, in my opinion, is really having to do with the cells, the cell types, because we're going to just talk about osteoblasts, osteoclasts, osteocytes over and over for the next 2 parts of this. All right. Okay, guys, have a great night. I'll see you.